On June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, one of the most ruthless campaigns in history began. In response, more than 800,000 Soviet women enlisted to defend their homeland, taking on roles as snipers, pilots, nurses, and partisans. They not only faced the dangers of the battlefield, but also unimaginable brutality when captured as prisoners. Of the thousands who were taken, few survived to tell their story. What atrocities did these women endure? Discover the abuses and tragic fates suffered by these warriors, from torture and executions to forced labor that destroyed their lives. Welcome to the Martial Memoirs. The mobilization of women in the Red Army. Response to the Nazi invasion. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of one of the most devastating episodes of World War II. With Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the conflict drastically escalated in scale and brutality. The Eastern Front would become one of the bloodiest, with millions of lives lost in prolonged combat. Faced with this surprise attack, the Soviet Union was forced into an immediate and massive response, mobilizing every available resource, including an unprecedented number of women in military roles. Until that point, women had largely been relegated to secondary or support roles in warfare. However, the urgent need for defense on the Eastern Front, along with Soviet ideology that promoted greater gender equality within the communist framework, paved the way for thousands of women to join the war effort directly. The call to arms was not an option but a necessity. The Soviet state depended on its entire population to resist the Nazi invasion. The Red Army needed not only soldiers but individuals trained for modern warfare, where aviation, artillery, and guerrilla tactics would play crucial roles. In this context, more than 800,000 women were recruited to serve in various capacities within the Soviet armed forces. Although many served in traditionally feminine roles, such as nursing, a significant number were trained for direct combat. The Soviet government actively encouraged female participation, portraying women as symbols of sacrifice and national resistance. War propaganda depicted women as heroines ready to die for their homeland, which, while inspiring, also made them clear targets for enemy violence. This call to arms was not without its challenges. The mass inclusion of women in military roles was met with a mix of support and skepticism by both the civilian population and the military itself. Commanders, accustomed to leading male forces, had to adapt to this new reality, where women would play active combat roles, not just logistical or medical support. For many women, participating in the war was not just a patriotic duty, but also an opportunity to prove their worth on the battlefield. However, the reality was far from the image of unity promoted by the Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin. In addition to facing the enemy's brutality, these women dealt with prejudice and distrust within their own ranks. Despite their bravery, respect from their comrades was not always immediate, and logistical difficulties, such as the lack of proper uniforms and shortages of supplies, worsened their situation. Thus, their fight was waged on two fronts, against the enemy and against the internal barriers of a society that still did not fully recognize them. Some female combatants managed to stand out on the battlefield and in public perception. A prominent example is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of the deadliest snipers of the war. Pavlichenko became a symbol of Soviet resistance, known for her skill and precision. By the end of the conflict, she was internationally recognized and celebrated as a heroine, awarded the Order of Lenin and honored with the title of Heroine of the Soviet Union. However, the fate of many other women was very different. Despite showing the same courage and dedication, their service was forgotten after the war ended. A significant case is that of Maria Vasilyevna Smirnova, a pilot who participated in more than 100 aerial missions. Despite her valor, at the end of the conflict, she did not receive the support or recognition she deserved. Smirnova returned home to face a society that did not value her contribution, living the rest of her life in poverty and anonymity. Yevdokia Zavali, the only woman to command a Marine infantry platoon in the Red Army, also faced difficulties upon returning to civilian life. Despite participating in some of the hardest battles of the conflict, Zavali did not receive the necessary support to rebuild her life. In a 1965 interview, she stated, They needed us in the war, but after the victory we were no longer necessary. Another example is Nina Petrova, a veteran sniper who served until the last days of the war. Petrova trained more than 500 soldiers, and her combat skills were recognized during the conflict. However, shortly after the war ended, she died in an accident without having received the honors or recognition that her service deserved. Her case illustrates the lack of attention many female veterans faced after completing their military service. Between life and death, women at war. As the Nazi army relentlessly advanced into the Soviet Union, the urgent need for reinforcements on the front became increasingly evident. The mobilization of women was not merely an ideological decision, but a matter of survival. Faced with the devastating invasion, the Soviet government expanded its recruitment to include thousands of women in the ranks of the Red Army. The Soviet Union became a pioneer in integrating women into combat during World War II, an unprecedented move for a nation of its size and a clear reflection of the war's desperation. However, this step forward did not come without challenges. The early battles were extremely brutal. The rapidly advancing Nazi forces showed no mercy in their path. The soldiers, including the female recruits, faced a modern war that combined tanks, heavy artillery, and aerial bombings with an intensity never before seen. For women, the battlefield was a hostile and terrifying environment. Yet retreat was not an option. For many of them, the idea of withdrawing or surrendering was unthinkable, as they were committed not only to defending their country, but also to proving their worth in a predominantly male environment. One of the most notable examples of these early combat experiences was that of the snipers. Initially met with skepticism, many women proved to be exceptionally skilled sharpshooters. They were trained in the use of precision rifles and sent to the front to eliminate key enemy officers and soldiers. Historical records mention that Soviet female snipers were not only effective, but in some cases outperformed their male counterparts in their ability to move stealthily and patiently among enemy lines. For these women, combat became an opportunity to demonstrate their courage and skill in a war where there was no distinction between genders when it came to inflicting death. The Soviet army also integrated women into other branches, such as aviation. Some of the recruits became pilots and co-pilots in night bombing missions, playing a crucial role in surprise attacks against Nazi forces. The Night Witches, as they were dubbed by the Germans, were an all-female aviator unit that became famous for their silent flying tactics and night bombings. These women flew lightweight, often outdated wooden and canvas biplanes, which made them extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. However, their bravery and ability to fly under German air defenses became legendary on the Eastern Front. Many of these women displayed remarkable physical and psychological strength, enduring the harsh conditions of the front, extreme cold, and the constant threat of being shot down by enemy fighters. Their bravery not only inspired other women to join the cause, but also proved that in times of war, the ability to kill or die did not distinguish between men and women. In addition to snipers and aviators, many women were assigned to more traditional roles, such as nurses and medics on the battlefield. Although they did not wield weapons, their work was equally crucial on the front lines. These women worked under enemy fire, treating the wounded, and in many cases, dying in their attempts to save lives. The courage of these nurses was recognized by their comrades and military high command, but their sacrifice was rarely acknowledged in the same way as that of their combatant counterparts. The Night Witches and the snipers, changing the course of the war. As the war progressed, the role of women in the Red Army not only became consolidated, but also began to stand out in key roles that directly impacted the battlefield. By 1942, the recruitment of women had reached its peak, and the Soviet army began to train them for specific specialties. Among these, two fields where women would demonstrate extraordinary capability were snipers and aviators. The women who served as snipers quickly earned a fearsome reputation among enemy ranks. Their training was not only exhaustive, but also extremely selective. It required surgical precision, extreme patience, and a psychological calm under pressure. In this context, one of the most iconic figures of World War II emerged, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Pavlichenko, a history student from Kiev, enlisted in the Red Army after the Nazi invasion. Her skill with a rifle led her to become one of the deadliest sharpshooters of the war, with over 300 confirmed kills, including high-ranking Nazi officers. Her precision and coolness on the battlefield made her a legend among her comrades and a threat to German forces. Lyudmila was an example of the many women who, as snipers, played a crucial role in Soviet defenses. Snipers were not only deployed at the front, but were also used in infiltration missions. They would hide in trenches or among vegetation for days, waiting for the exact moment to eliminate strategic targets. Their ability to move undetected and their endurance in harsh weather conditions made them an indispensable asset. During the Battle of Stalingrad, for instance, snipers helped halt the German advance at key points, eliminating enemy commanders and spreading panic among Nazi troops. However, behind the success in combat lay a significant emotional burden. Snipers faced immense psychological pressure. Often isolated, they relied solely on their stealth and rifle. The long hours of waiting, coupled with the weight of having to kill with precision, developed in these women a tough and resilient character. Yet in their letters and diaries, many expressed the internal contradiction they experienced, pride in defending their homeland against the enemy, and the pain of being responsible for so many lives taken. In addition to Pavlichenko, other Soviet snipers gained notoriety during the war. The young Nina Lobkovskaya, for example, commanded a sniper platoon during the siege of Berlin in 1945. Her bravery and leadership marked the end of the war in Europe, demonstrating that the role of female snipers was crucial in the final stages of the conflict. For many of these women, combat was not only a matter of patriotism, but also personal survival in a war that made no gender distinction when it came to killing or dying. While snipers operated mostly on the ground, female aviators took their fight to the skies. A special detachment, known as the 46th Night Bomber Regiment, earned the dreaded nickname the Night Witches for their night bombing tactics. This group of female pilots, commanded by Marina Raskova, became a true nightmare for the Nazi forces. The Night Witches flew lightweight and outdated aircraft, usually Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, which were slow and vulnerable. However, their slow speed became an advantage, as they could fly under enemy radar and perform maneuvers other aircraft couldn't execute. Under the cover of darkness, they would shut off their engines as they descended to drop their bombs on Nazi positions, flying almost in silence. Hence their nickname. German soldiers said the planes glided through the air like witches on broomsticks. The missions of the Night Witches were extremely dangerous. The planes lacked advanced weaponry, meaning the aviators could not defend themselves against enemy fighters. Despite these limitations, these women carried out more than 30,000 bombing missions throughout the war, significantly contributing to halting the Nazi advance in the Caucasus and other strategic areas. One of their most notable operations took place in the Stalingrad region, where the Night Witches conducted nighttime raids on German positions, precisely dropping bombs on ammunition depots and supply lines. During the Battle of Stalingrad, their participation was crucial, as they helped disrupt the enemy's supply lines at a critical moment in the conflict. Another significant example was their incursion at Kursk, where their bombings contributed to the Soviet victory in one of the largest battles of the war. Among the most distinguished aviators was Nadezhda Popova, who completed more than 850 combat missions during the war. Popova survived many aerial battles and became a symbol of resilience. Her unit, with very limited resources, demonstrated great strategic skill that allowed them to overcome the technical disadvantages of their aircraft. Surviving the horror, trauma, hunger, and the cold at -30 degrees. As the conflict progressed, life on the front lines for Soviet women soldiers took on a unique brutality. Unlike the stories of heroism and military tactics told in the history of snipers and aviators, daily life on the battlefield was defined by extreme physical and psychological hardship. For the women fighting, the simple act of surviving became an additional battle. Life in the trenches and on the front lines was marked by extremely precarious conditions. The cold was one of the most relentless enemies, especially during the harsh Russian winters. Temperatures could drop below -30 degrees Celsius, meaning that soldiers, including women, fought not only the enemy but also hypothermia. In many cases, women slept in improvised shelters without proper equipment to protect themselves from the weather. as resources were scarce and prioritized for immediate war needs. Statistics show that during the winters of 1941 and 1942, cold-related illnesses, such as severe frostbite, affected approximately 20% of soldiers on Soviet battlefronts. Many of these women lost fingers and toes due to frostbite, and without means for proper treatment, infections were common. In some cases, reports indicate that disease casualties outnumbered those from direct combat. Another significant challenge for women on the front was food. Supplies were limited, and the chaos of war made it difficult for soldiers to receive food regularly. Women, like their male comrades, relied on combat rations that rarely covered the caloric needs required for the physical demands of battle. It is estimated that during the most intense offensives, such as the Battle of Stalingrad, daily rations for Soviet soldiers were reduced to 500 grams of bread and a light soup, representing less than half of the recommended caloric intake for a soldier in combat. Often, these women had to resort to foraging on the battlefield, including wild herbs or small animals they could hunt in the area. This chronic hunger weakened the troops, affecting their ability to stay alert and combative. The lack of hygiene was another factor adding misery to life on the front. Women fighters not only faced the same unsanitary conditions as men, but they also dealt with specific health issues related to their gender. On many fronts, there was no sanitary provision, making gynecological infections common. Furthermore, access to clean water was scarce, increasing the likelihood of contracting gastrointestinal diseases. Reports show that respiratory infections, such as pneumonia, and stomach illnesses were frequent among the troops, with 30% of soldiers reporting health problems related to poor hygiene. One of the most heartbreaking aspects for women was that amidst all of this there was no room for weakness. The Soviet army expected the same level of endurance from women as from men, and any display of vulnerability was seen as a lack of commitment to the cause. Consequently, many women fighters concealed their pain and illness, which only worsened their suffering. The constant physical and emotional pressure took a massive psychological toll on women at the front. The war not only demanded that they endure the horror of seeing their comrades die or be gravely wounded, but also required them to maintain mental strength in an environment that gave no respite. Testimonies from Soviet women soldiers show that many of them began experiencing what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though at the time it was not formally recognized as a psychological condition. One of the most moving accounts is that of Zoya Kroll, a nurse who, after months on the front lines at Stalingrad, lost the ability to sleep due to the constant images of the wounded and dead she tended to. Zoya writes in one of her letters, "The screams of the wounded men wouldn't leave me in peace, and even when I closed my eyes, I still saw them. Sometimes I wished it was me who had fallen, just to stop hearing those screams." Such experiences were common among women, who, in addition to combat, also cared for their wounded comrades, witnessing first-hand human suffering in its rawest form. The psychological exhaustion was so severe that many fighters suffered from what doctors of the time called war hysteria, a condition manifested in panic attacks, uncontrollable crying, or momentary paralysis due to accumulated trauma. Although there are no clear statistics on how many women were affected by this condition, it is estimated that over 15% of combatants developed symptoms of PTSD throughout the conflict. Despite the terrible conditions, women soldiers developed a strong sense of camaraderie among themselves. In many cases, they shared intimate experiences and built emotional bonds that helped them endure the harshness of war. This companionship was shown in small gestures, such as sharing part of their scarce rations or caring for each other in the midst of battle. Letters exchanged between some of these women reflect a profound sense of sisterhood, a bond that transcended political or regional differences. For example, in one account collected from a former combatant, Anna Petrenko, she describes how she and a trenchmate, despite not knowing each other previously, became inseparable during the harsh months on the front. "She became my sister. There was no need to talk much because we both knew that at the end of the day we only had each other," Petrenko wrote in one of her memoirs. The terror of invasion, Soviet women fighters on the Third Reich front. This was one of the most atrocious aspects of the war. As the conflict advanced and the clashes between the Red Army and the forces of the Third Reich intensified, Women on the front lines faced not only the horrors of combat, but also a more cruel and systematic violence when captured by the enemy. To the Nazis, women fighters represented not only a military threat, but also an ideological challenge to the rigid gender norms they upheld. As a result, their treatment was particularly brutal. For Nazi leaders and their soldiers, Soviet women on the front lines were seen as an ideological abomination. Hitler had made it clear that a woman's place was in the home, supporting the war effort through domestic work, not on the battlefield. This conception clashed with the reality of Soviet women, who, under the communist regime, were encouraged to actively fight on the front lines. The clash of these views fueled Nazi hatred toward women fighters. The disdain for Soviet women soldiers was reflected in the speeches of several high-ranking Third Reich officers who described them as communist beasts or traitors to their gender. This hatred translated into an unofficial policy of extermination and mistreatment, with summary executions and torture carried out frequently and systematically. As women were captured by Nazi troops, their fate was, in most cases, death. Orders for immediate execution were common, especially in the final years of the war when hatred toward the Soviets reached its peak. Instead of being treated as prisoners of war, women were seen as traitors, both for being Soviet and for having taken up arms. One of the most emblematic cases was that of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a young partisan captured by the Nazis in 1941 and publicly executed in a Moscow village. Although her case preceded the events of 1943 and 1944, it served as a precursor to the brutality that would be unleashed against women fighters. It is known that in many cases women were tortured before being killed, and their bodies were publicly displayed as a warning to other Soviet fighters. The figures are chilling. It is estimated that thousands of women soldiers and partisans captured by the Nazis were summarily executed without trial. On the Eastern Front, the treatment of prisoners of war was brutal in general, but Soviet women soldiers were victims of even more extreme violence, with a high percentage of executions carried out immediately. Sexual abuse was one of the most atrocious forms of violence directed toward captured women. Although sexual violence is a reality in almost all armed conflicts, on the Eastern Front, sexual violence was deliberately used by the Nazis to humiliate and demoralize Soviet women fighters. Survivor testimonies and historical investigations reveal that many of these women were subjected to gang rapes before being killed, or in some cases kept alive for days to be sexually exploited by Nazi troops. The psychological impact of this violence was devastating. Some women survivors described how, after being captured and abused, they wished for death more than survival, knowing they would never be the same after such trauma. Military documents from the time rarely mention these crimes, but testimonies from prisoners liberated by the Red Army recount indescribable horrors. Although there are no exact figures on how many Soviet women soldiers were victims of sexual violence, estimates suggest that a large proportion of those captured faced this fate. Sexual violence was an integral part of the inhumane treatment the Nazis inflicted on women fighters, using it as a weapon to morally destroy their victims. Those women who were not immediately executed were sent to prisoner of war camps where conditions were equally inhumane. The camps for Soviet prisoners were notorious for their brutality, and for women, the humiliation and mistreatment knew no bounds. The mortality rate in these camps was alarming. Female prisoners received less food and medical attention than their male counterparts, leading to a slow death from starvation or diseases that could have easily been prevented under different circumstances. One of the most shocking testimonies comes from Yelena Mazanik, a Soviet partisan captured by the Nazis in 1943 and sent to a prisoner camp in Poland. In her memoirs, Mazanik describes how she and other women were forced to perform hard labor until exhaustion, all under the constant threat of brutal punishment. Many women, according to Mazanik, chose suicide as a way to escape the endless physical and psychological torture they endured daily. Physical and sexual violence was only part of the cruel treatment toward women fighters. Psychological terror played an equally devastating role. The Nazis implemented fear tactics, such as forcing women to witness the execution of their comrades or keeping them in solitary confinement for long periods. This tactic aimed to break the prisoners' spirits, leaving them in a state of absolute despair. One of the most inhumane methods was public humiliation. On several occasions, women were exposed to crowds, forced to parade naked or in degrading conditions before being executed. This type of symbolic violence sought not only to destroy the morale of the female prisoners, but also to send a message of terror to the Soviet population and other women fighters. Unleashed brutality, massacres and torture on the battlefield. On October 24, 1943, Nazi brutality reached a peak when several captured Soviet women fighters were summarily executed near a small village in Ukraine. This was just one of many dark episodes where Soviet women soldiers and partisans faced a merciless fate at the hands of the Nazi army. The execution of captured women, accompanied by physical and psychological torture, became a routine practice as Axis forces sought to quell the resistance of the Red Army. The case of Masha Bruskina is one of the most representative of the fate of Soviet women. Captured in Minsk in 1941 and executed on October 26th of the same year, her case set a precedent for the mass executions of women fighters. Bruskina, a nurse and partisan, barely 17 years old, was publicly hanged after being forced to parade with a sign reading, "We are traitors to the motherland." Although this incident took place at the beginning of the war, the years 1943 and 1944 saw a notable increase in such reprisals. In the same October of 1943, dozens of partisan and soldier women were captured at various points along the Eastern Front and subjected to the same brutality. On October 24th, 16 Soviet women fighters, all snipers captured in the Cherkasy region, were taken to the outskirts of a small village by a Wehrmacht unit. After days of interrogations and torture, the women, weakened and terrified, were summarily executed one by one in mass graves. A German soldier present at the execution, in a testimony recovered years later, described the scene as one of the darkest days of the war. Physical torture was a method employed not only to obtain information, but also as an act of sheer cruelty. Methods ranged from constant beatings and burns to mutilation of body parts, with the intent of breaking both the bodies and spirits of the prisoners. In some cases, they were inflicted with severe wounds that went untreated, with the expectation that infection and pain would force them to cooperate. One of the most commonly used methods was simulated suffocation, where prisoners were repeatedly hanged or suffocated without immediate death, prolonging their suffering. This procedure was used to extract confessions, although many women, knowing their ultimate fate would be death, refused to betray their comrades, enduring the torment to the end. A few women managed to survive capture and torture. Their testimonies reveal the extent of Nazi cruelty and offer a harrowing glimpse into those moments. Yekaterina Zelenko, a Soviet aviator captured and tortured in September of 1943, managed to escape weeks later. In her account, Zelenko recalls how she was subjected to electric shocks and systematic rapes by her captors. "We were not seen as human," she wrote in her memoirs. "To them we were animals that had to be tamed, punished for daring to fight like men." Zelenko made it back to the Soviet side, but many of her comrades were not as fortunate. One of the most harrowing testimonies comes from Tatiana Baramzina, a Soviet sniper captured by the Nazis in July of 1944. Tatiana was tortured for hours before being executed with a shot to the head. Though she did not survive to tell her story, Russian historians have detailed how she was publicly humiliated, forced to dig her own grave before being brutally killed. Statistics on the number of captured and executed Soviet women soldiers vary, but it is estimated that by 1944, more than 5,000 women who served as snipers, aviators, nurses, and partisans were killed under similar circumstances across different points of the Eastern Front. These figures do not include the thousands of women who perished in concentration camps, where hunger and disease slowly claimed their lives. The public display of the executions of Soviet women soldiers had a clear purpose: to demoralize the enemy and instill fear among the combatants. In several villages along the Eastern Front, the bodies of the prisoners were hung in public squares or displayed at city entrances for civilians to see. These macabre scenes were designed to send a clear message: those who fought against the Reich would be exterminated in the most brutal way possible. Under fire, the partisan struggle against Nazism. On November 5, 1943, the partisan resistance in the Soviet Union experienced one of its most significant moments. On this day, A group of women partisans launched a sabotage operation against Nazi forces occupying a village near Smolensk. The context was already one of total war, but in the occupied territories, women fighters not only faced the enemy in conventional battles, but also through guerrilla tactics, constantly risking their lives on clandestine missions. The partisan resistance, composed of both men and women, was crucial in the fight against the Nazi occupiers. However, women played a particular and often overlooked role in these actions, carrying out sabotage, espionage, and logistical operations that weakened the enemy from within. These operations were often as dangerous as frontline battles, and the women involved in them faced a high risk of being captured and suffering brutal Nazi reprisals. The autumn of 1943 marked a shift in Soviet resistance tactics, and women partisans were at the center of this change. Women not only actively participated in sabotage operations and direct attacks, but also took on leadership roles. Among them was Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, one of the most famous Soviet partisans, who was captured and executed by the Nazis in November of 1941, 2 years before the events described in this chapter. Her story inspired thousands of women to join the underground fight. In the weeks leading up to November 5th, a carefully planned operation led a group of 30 women to destroy a key railway used by the Nazis to transport supplies. These operations, known as railway hunts, were vital to weakening the German logistical infrastructure. The Nazis relied on trains to maintain their supply lines, and partisans, both men and women, knew that destroying the railways could halt the enemy's advance. Olga Fedoseva, one of the leaders of the November 5th operation, left a detailed account of the mission. In her diary, she described how, under the cover of night, she and her group walked for miles through the forests, carrying explosives that had to be placed at strategic points along the tracks. "The silence was total," she wrote. "We knew that a single sound could alert the Germans and mean death for us all." The women partisans did not wear uniforms or insignia to avoid identification in case of capture. However, this made them easy targets for Nazi reprisals, who did not respect international laws of war. Sabotage was one of the most effective tools of the partisan resistance, and women played a crucial role in these operations. In addition to destroying railways, they also attacked supply lines and weapons depots. In another case, Nina Onilova, a sniper who also worked as a partisan, led an attack on a German convoy on November 11, 1943, destroying a train carrying fuel. Onilova, like many other women in the resistance, combined her military skills with knowledge of the local geography, allowing her to execute operations with surgical precision. Women also played essential roles in espionage. One of the most dangerous tasks was infiltrating occupied territory to gather information on German troop movements. Maria Polivanova, another prominent partisan, infiltrated enemy lines several times disguised as a peasant, collecting data that was later used to plan ambushes or surprise attacks. This ability to move between enemy lines was crucial to the success of many resistance operations. The female partisan resistance paid a high price for their bravery. On November 8, 1943, during a mission to destroy a key bridge over the Desna River, a group of women partisans was ambushed by a German patrol. After hours of combat, the women were captured and executed in a forest clearing. The Germans displayed their bodies in the nearest village square as a warning to those considering joining the resistance. This kind of reprisal was common, and often the families of the women fighters also suffered the consequences, being deported or killed. Maria Semyonova, a partisan who participated in the same operation, was one of the few survivors. In her memoirs, she describes how she and her comrades were surrounded by German troops as they tried to place the explosives on the bridge. "We were discovered just as we were about to finish," she wrote. "We tried to flee, but the shots hit us before we could reach the forest." Despite her efforts to save her comrades, Semyonova saw them fall one by one into the hands of the enemy. The female partisan resistance faced not only the dangers of combat, but also a constant struggle to be taken seriously by their comrades. Often, women were seen as auxiliaries rather than full combatants. However, over time, their battlefield achievements began to be recognized, and many were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. One of the most moving episodes of this stage of the war occurred on November 15, 1943, when a group of women partisans led by Vera Koruzhaya launched an offensive against a German detachment in the forests of Belarus. Koruzhaya, a committed communist, had organized the women to carry out a series of coordinated attacks. However, after being captured, she was tortured and executed by German forces. Her sacrifice, along with that of many others, became a symbol of the absolute commitment of Soviet women in the fight against Nazism. Many Soviet women joined the partisan resistance, facing not only the Nazi army, but also the traditional expectations society had imposed on them before the war. It is estimated that more than 28,000 women fought and collaborated in the resistance, carrying out missions that, in many cases, changed the course of their lives. By the end of 1943, the sacrifice of these women began to influence the course of the war, weakening the German forces and accelerating their retreat from the Eastern Front. Witnesses of sacrifice, doctors and nurses at the brink of despair. From the beginning of the Nazi invasion, the conflict was defined not only by the battles on the front lines, but also by the relentless efforts of the women who served as doctors and nurses under extreme conditions. As the fighting intensified, Soviet troop casualties increased, requiring a swift and effective medical response. However, these women were not merely supporters. Many became the first line of defense for wounded soldiers, and their contribution was vital to the war effort. At the start of the war, the Soviet healthcare system was overwhelmed. The numbers were staggering. It is estimated that in the first months of the war, the Red Army suffered more than 700,000 casualties, necessitating an immediate medical response. Women began enlisting in large numbers in military hospitals and as ambulance staff. In 1941, the Soviet government established the Combat Nurse Corps, where many women received specialized training to care for the wounded on the front lines. Doctors and nurses faced unique challenges. Not only did they have to deal with the scarcity of medical supplies and the inhumane conditions of field hospitals, but they also faced the constant danger of being attacked. Nurses working on the front lines, such as Lyudmila Mikhailova, often risked being hit by artillery fire while attending to soldiers. Mikhailova, who served on the Stalingrad front, recounted in her memoirs that every day was a fight to save lives, but also a fight for our own survival. Field hospitals where nurses worked were often located near the front lines and lacked the minimum sanitary conditions necessary to treat patients. The massive influx of wounded was overwhelming, and medical staff struggled to maintain a level of care amid the despair. Nurses worked 12-hour shifts or more, often in extreme cold or under bombardment. The statistics are revealing. During the Battle of Stalingrad, more than 40,000 Soviet soldiers were treated in field hospitals, many of which were staffed almost exclusively by women. Nurses and doctors were responsible not only for performing surgical procedures, but also for organizing the logistics of caring for the wounded, from blood supplies to patient transport. Valentina Sherbakova, another distinguished nurse, worked on the front lines and was involved in evacuating wounded soldiers. In an interview, she recalled, "There was no time for fear. When someone screamed for help, I couldn't hesitate. It was my duty." During one of the bombings, Sherbakova risked entering a burning building to rescue a group of trapped soldiers. "I knew it could be the last time I did it, but I didn't think about it. They depended on me." The sacrifice of these women was immense. At times, when the front moved quickly, nurses had to leave behind critically wounded soldiers. However, many chose to stay behind, taking personal risks to care for those who could not be evacuated. This devotion to the cause was common among the women serving on the battlefield. Women doctors also made significant contributions. One prominent figure was Dr. Yevdokia Zavali, who became one of the first combat surgeons. During the Battle of Kursk in 1943, she performed over 300 operations in field conditions, often under extremely precarious circumstances. Zavali's determination and dedication to saving lives earned her several medals for bravery and efficiency. Zavali recounted that the first operations were performed in makeshift tents, where conditions for asepsis were almost non-existent. A soldier could be on the brink of death and you had to act fast. Every second counted, she said. This type of situation required not only exceptional medical skills, but also incredible mental strength to stay calm amidst the chaos. Over time, their efforts were officially recognized. The Soviet government began awarding medals and distinctions to the women who had served in the field, which helped bring visibility to their role in the war. By the end of the war, more than 200,000 women had served in the armed forces as medical personnel, and many continued their medical careers after the conflict. The forgotten heroines, the tireless struggle for recognition after the war. After the end of the Second World War in May of 1945, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the victorious nations, although the human cost of the war was devastating. Millions of lives were lost, and many women who fought on the front lines faced a new battle, the struggle for recognition of their sacrifices. As society focused on reconstruction, the contributions of women in the conflict began to be marginalized. Returning to civilian life was complicated for many female veterans. While men returning from the front were welcomed as heroes, women often faced neglect. Soviet propaganda glorified the male soldier, relegating women to a secondary role in the narrative of the war. Those who served as combatants, medics, or nurses were forced back into traditional roles in society. In December of 1943, the town of Gomel in Belarus witnessed a brutal demonstration of Nazi power. 10 female partisans were hanged in the central square, and their bodies were left exposed for days so that the inhabitants, forced to walk by, would not forget the message. The Nazi commander in charge wanted this cruelty to serve as a clear warning to those considering joining the resistance. The perception that war was a male domain limited their reintegration into the social and labor spheres. The Soviet Women's Commission, established after the war, tried to address some of these issues, although it focused more on family welfare than on recognizing women's experiences on the front lines. As the government rebuilt the economy and infrastructure, the stories of female fighters became a distant memory. In addition to the lack of recognition, many women who participated in the war faced stigmas. The war left physical and psychological scars. Many veterans suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition not well understood at the time. The traumatic experiences and treatment as prisoners of war left marks that often could not be shared. This created a cycle of silence, where women preferred to hide their experiences for fear of not being understood. In the years following the war, some women tried to tell their stories. Periodicals and magazines began to include veterans' accounts, although these were often superficial and lacked depth. Despite some efforts to document their experiences, many of the significant contributions of women in the war continued to be ignored in the official historical narrative. In a society focused on male heroes, the stories of women, even those who performed heroic acts, faded away. A notable case was that of Maria Vasilyevna Vasilyeva, a veteran who, after the war, dedicated her life to documenting the stories of her comrades. In her book, The Warriors of the Motherland, Vasilyeva narrated the contributions of hundreds of women, but the publication was ignored by publishers unwilling to acknowledge the vital role of women in the war. Despite her efforts, her accounts were largely lost to history. Over the years, the historical narrative began to change slowly. In the 1960s, historians and activists initiated efforts to recover the stories of women in the war. With de-Stalinization and the opening of archives, the contributions of women in the conflict began to gain visibility. However, full recognition did not come until much later. Starting in 1970, several veterans began to receive medals and honors that had initially been denied. In 1975, during the International Women's Year, events and exhibitions were organized in the Soviet Union highlighting the role of women in the war. However, there was still a noticeable gap in the official narrative, which continued to prioritize male stories. Many veterans continued fighting for their memory, forming support groups and participating in conferences to share their experiences. Over the years, the legacy of the women who served in the Second World War has taken on new meaning. Recognition of their role has inspired new generations to value and remember the history of these warriors. Today, many of their stories are studied and are being included in textbooks. The importance of remembering their contributions lies in historical justice and the relevance of their struggle in the context of women's rights today. Recognition of women in the war has influenced the discourse on gender equality and led to greater acceptance of women in combat and leadership roles. The stories of Soviet women who fought in the Second World War are an integral part of the collective memory of the war. Their bravery, sacrifice, and contributions in the face of extreme adversity offer significant lessons for the contemporary world. As societies face challenges related to gender violence and equal rights, it is crucial to reflect on the legacy these women have left behind.